Scooby-Doo is a franchise that's been going on for over 5 decades in dozens of different incarnations. A lot of people grew up with this show, and maybe some of these monsters even scarred you in a way that left you scared of clowns or robots in the future. But I truly believe that everyone can find a monster in the deep, deep roster of this franchise that chills them to their core. Of course, some monsters are pretty well agreed to be scarier than others, and I've already done a video tackling which monster from the original Scooby-Doo Where Are You is the scariest. So today, I'm going to be doing the same thing for the Scooby-Doo Show. To reiterate my criteria, we're looking for monsters that are supernatural, although this isn't always necessary, just something that's nice to have, a strong setting, a good design, and an actual threat. For more of an explanation on these criteria, check out my previous video. But also, please keep in mind that what's scary is subjective. If you're afraid of alligators, then obviously the gator ghoul will scare you a lot more than Gramps the Vamp or the pterodactyl ghost. So give me some leniency if you disagree with my assessment. I'm doing my best to be objective, but this is an inherently subjective topic. By all means, if one of your favorites is lower on the list, let me know and maybe I'll be able to appreciate that monster in a whole new way. All of that being said though, we've got 40 monsters to get through, so we have no time to waste. Welcome to Singularity. Starting with the absolute worst of the worst, I have to put the ghost of the warlock Anthos in last place. As I said before, horror is inherently subjective, but I have a hard time believing that anyone was disturbed by this guy. He just looks so ridiculous. Nothing about this design is threatening or spooky, and he never really does anything to put the gang in danger. He shows up 4 or 5 times, makes vague threats about the curse of Anthos, and disappears. Add all of that to the weird gimmick with the glasses and invisible makeup at the end, and this episode is honestly more baffling than anything. I'm genuinely curious if anyone was scared of this guy. If so, please drop a comment and let me know what about him stood out to you, because from my standpoint, there's nothing really memorable about this Ren Fair region. Continuing on with the theme of monsters that are too goofy to be scary, we have the ghost of Juan Carlos. Design-wise, there's nothing that stands out apart from the frankly ridiculous pantaloons, and the setting of the fortress just feels so generic and ineffective. We've gotten stuff like this before. But the biggest detractor is that not even the episode itself can be bothered to take Juan Carlos seriously. Rather than the usual chase scenes and jump scares, this episode has a weird B-plot of Shaggy and Scooby constantly trying to throw the gang off from the fact that there's a mystery in the first place. It's not necessarily bad, but it's really distracting and just proves the point that even the writers didn't think this ghost was spooky enough to justify the episode. Moving from some of the later episodes in the series to a season 1 specter, Tamuka the Ghost Bull really doesn't impress me. The opening scene is actually pretty well done, and I've taken enough midnight drives down a country road to know that any loud noise or startling imagery can be terrifying. But conceptually, Tamuka just isn't that scary. It's a culture-bound monster, meaning that it's scariest to people who grew up in that culture. Maybe if I had grown up being told stories of Tamuka the same way that I grew up hearing about Bloody Mary or the Hawkman, it would work better. But as is, it really falls flat. Granted, Tamuka's not the only monster in this episode. We also have a medicine man ghost, but he never really does anything threatening, and looks like someone copied Where Are You's Witch Doctor and changed the answers just enough not to get caught by the teacher. In the same vein as Anthos, we have the ghost of Merlin. Now I know that Merlin is fairly beloved by a section of the Scooby fanbase, but similar to Anthos, he just isn't scary. The outfit is silly, and the episode never tries to present him as particularly horrific or threatening. For me, the last straw is the pointy hat. Without that, at least you have like a scary old man kind of monster, similar to the creepy keeper from What's New, but the pointy hat is just so unapologetically goofy and solidifies Merlin as one of the least intimidating monsters I've ever seen. Now, Merlin does use the same gimmick as the ghost clown, hypnosis, but where the ghost clown used it effectively to make himself scarier by robbing victims of their own control and independence, this episode frames it as a comedic effect with goofy laughs and tongue twisters. I won't deny that this episode is memorable, but Merlin looks more like my grandfather than anything that would give me trouble sleeping at night. It's memorable for all the wrong reasons. From a monster that's basically just a man in a bathrobe to one of the most animalistic creatures in the Scooby-Doo show's roster, does anyone even remember the Jaguaro? It's more interesting than the Ape Man, I'll give it that, and the sound effect is surprisingly good. Hearing what's basically a human scream come from this creature is really unsettling. But yet again, we have an episode that doesn't do any favors for its monsters. A lot of this episode is devoted to the tribesmen, which doesn't leave much room for the Jaguaro to make an impression, and if we're being honest, the design doesn't do a lot either. A chimerical monster that looks like God played Mr. Potato Head with the world's most ferocious beasts is a great concept. But in practice, we just have Gorilla Grodd with a furry mask slammed over his head. But at least it's a unique and memorable design. The same can't be said for the Ghost Witch of Old Salem. There's really not that much you can do with a witch. The usual visual cues for witches just don't lend themselves to the most standout horror icon design. The ghost of Melissa Wilcox specifically is basically a rehash of the witch from Where Are You, and in the canon of the episode is supposedly the spitting image of Arlene Wilcox, so there's really not much you can do there. And yet again, we have an episode that betrays itself, with To Switch a Witch being so focused on witch trials and dressing up 20th century citizens like colonial shakers that it never explores the potential in a monster being a dark mirror of someone that you know. If you're sensing a theme, there's a reason. A lot of episodes in Season 3 of the Scooby-Doo Show end up not really feeling like episodes of Scooby-Doo. A bunch of the sound effects, dialogue, and even concepts feel like they belong in an episode of Super Friends, and consequently, a lot of them lose the Scooby-Doo magic that we all know and love. There are some production reasons behind this that we just don't have the time to get into, but don't worry. At least a few of these monsters do crack their way into the higher tiers. Rounding out the C string, we have the ghost of Witch McCoy. Everything that I said about Melissa Wilcox holds true here as well. Bland design, boring sound effects. At least we do have a real threat here, the idea that the witch can turn you into a frog. But framing this whole episode through a Hatfields and McCoy's lens is such a baffling choice to me. Giving a monster a gimmick is not always a good thing if that gimmick comes at the expense of showcasing what makes the monster a valid threat. Moving past the bottom tier, here are some monsters that I can see what the writers were going for. All of these monsters have something that stands out, and I could see them sticking with a young kid who found Scooby-Doo channel surfing, but they all lack that special charm. None of these are classics. I wouldn't even say that they're mid, but there's something there. And the first contender here is the Spectre of Milo Booth. Now, design-wise, there's actually a lot going for him here. The ghoulish face with the blood-red sclera is pretty striking, and manages to look humanoid. It looks like Milo Booth, while sidestepping the blandness that we see in Juan Carlos and the Ghost Witch of Old Salem. But a decent design can only do so much when the setting of your episode is a luxurious train. It's not scary in the least, and the monster has little to no screen time. A monster that actually really disappointed me personally was this trio of monsters, the Spirits of 76, the ghosts of Benedict Arnold, William Demont, and Major Andre. There is a huge amount of potential in these guys. We see the wax statues standing in their display, and the idea of those statues coming to life and prowling the museum, a suitably spooky setting when it's closed down, is enough to make my skin crawl. In fact, we even get a shot of them walking away from the display once the gang isn't looking. That works to build tension. Them being living wax statues even makes up for the boring design. If that's intentional, we get a nice Uncanny Valley feeling, similar to the Wax Phantom but separate enough to still work. But then the episode goes and classifies them as ghosts for some reason? If they had been wax statues come to life, they would have ranked a lot higher for me, but the Scooby writers, for whatever reason, decided to instead make them ghosts, immediately and irreversibly making them so much less interesting. This one might come as a surprise if you've seen my previous video on Where Are You, but hear me out. The Technicolor Phantoms from the Ghost of the Bad Humor Man might have the same look as the Phantom Shadows from A Night of Fright is No Delight, but the differences speak a lot louder than the similarities here. Starting with the colors, we've swapped out an eerie green that fades into the shadows for vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. I get the joke, they're Neapolitan apparitions, but having also lost the rattling chains and all the fantastic build-up from the prior episode just erases all of the appeal. We've gone from the coffin moment, one of the single most chilling scares in Where Are You, to an agonizingly dragging scene of Shaggy being mistaken for one of the villains. 10 down, and next up is the Creepy Heap, a bit of an enigma of a monster. Now, Scooby-Doo has never been a stranger to aquatic antagonists, and I'm all for it. The sea is an inexhaustible resource of terror, but the Creepy Heap is a big miss for me. There's just no unifying concept here. Maybe they were going for a kind of eldritch, unknowable vibe, but if so, other monsters manage that a lot better. Between the seaweed hair, the pinchy claws, and the faded school bus color, the monster ends up looking really unconsidered, like the character designer didn't fully know what was expected. No character design can work without a solid concept, and the only reason the Creepy Heap is up this high is because of this amazing scene of Captain Clemens having his soul stolen away. I always love these scenes where we get to see the monster in action because it establishes the threat of the episode, and this one in particular gives us a secondary monster, so credit where credit is due. Let's speed through the next few. The Snow Beast is alright, I'm always a fan of these more frigid phantasms, but my recurring complaint of the episode not doing a good job showcasing the monster comes back up, and if we're being honest, this design is pretty hit or miss. The Ghost of King Katazuma is fine, but not exceptional. There are diminishing returns on having a monster grow bigger and bigger, and the Aztec stone statue is pretty much a rehash of Monotikitia. This episode has some alright moments, but they're few and far between, and the lack of any standout settings is a letdown. Mamba Wamba is another culture-bound creep, so your mileage here may vary. Honestly, the main reason he is as high as he is because I really love the idea of a friend of the gang being turned into a mindless zombie by the freak of the week. The Ghost of Finian McDuff does a lot of things right. He glows, flies, disappears, and the more ghastly pallor works pretty well, but at the end of the day, this is another monster that just looks like a human man, so we can't put him that high. And finally, we have the Skeleton Men from the Bermuda Triangle. If I'm being completely honest, they probably should be a bit lower on this list. They are pretty much just glorified scuba suits, but I have to award points for using the literal Bermuda Triangle as a setting, and there are a few pretty great shots. I particularly love when they appear in the submarine skylight because it gives a really voyeuristic look, like these aliens are watching you from an observation deck. If this episode had leaned more into this brand of horror, it would probably rank a fair bit higher. Whew, that was a lot. Fortunately, the Scooby-Doo Show has a lot of nightmare-worthy monsters, so let's jump into some of the scarier specters and shades the show has to offer. Starting with the Viking ghosts from Season 2. Sure, these are more just-a-person ghosts, but on the other hand, they're actual Vikings. And between the monstrous red eyes and the longboat appearing out of nowhere at the beginning, if these guys scared you as a kid, I can't blame you. They fall short mostly because there's still a lot of room for improvement, both in the way the episode plays out and in the design itself. But don't let that detract from the genuinely really great moments in this episode. Similarly, the Willowaw is pretty good. I love the banshee-like quality of the creature. If it says your name, you'll die soon. It's a great way of roping the gang further into the action. And while this one is another cultural scare, the Willowaw would be spookiest to kids who grew up hearing stories about it, I think we can all agree that owls are scarier than bulls. All that being said, this episode got the Season 3 treatment. There's no real effort to disguise the fact that the Willowaw was a machine and the Owlmen were just men in costumes, and That's a real shame because conceptually, this is one of the strongest episodes of the series. On the flip side of that is a monster or group of monsters that have a pretty vanilla concept but handle it extremely well. In the season 1 episode Scooby-Doo Where's the Crew, the gang is helping explore an old shipwreck when three nautical ne'er-do-wells, the legendary ghost of Captain Pescado, an octopus monster, and a kelp monster, trap them on the boat. The isolation of this episode is palpable, and while none of the three monsters are particularly gruesome, I love that we get three unique designs tackling the subject matter from three different angles. There's a number of great scares in this episode, but my personal favorite is how the wet footprints are seeded out early on to build tension and terror when we find those same footsteps leading to Captain Poisson's chambers. Early Scooby-Doo didn't do this kind of setup payoff very often, so the amazing usage of Chekhov's footsteps, for lack of a better term, really jumped out to me. The main reason they aren't higher is because this episode gets really repetitive. There are at least 5 different occasions where one of the monsters locks someone in a room, and it's played straight every time. This might be smart for the actual villains, but that sort of scene only works once, if that. I do like these guys more every time I watch the episode, but let's lock them in at spot number 22. Moving on, let's talk about the Phantom. Yeah, this Kiss groupie is never actually called a disc demon in the episode, he's just the Phantom, same as Bluestone. Regardless, he's pretty great. While he is based on the band Kiss, if you take those performers out of the context of the band itself, they could be pretty intimidating to a young child, and some of the animation in this episode is just randomly way better than usual, which gives an incredibly uncanny feeling to the monster. A specific scene that I really like is the very opening scene with the Phantom threatening Tony. He seems really dangerous, setting him up as a genuine threat. So despite what may seem like a goofy concept, there's a lot of merit to this guy. Moving from the recording studio to the gridiron, let's talk about Rambling Ghost, the specter of a football player who was booed out of the stadium and swore his revenge, only to come back decades later as another classic Scooby-Doo mystery. On the surface, he may seem like a pretty basic monster of the week, but he's got a very effective appearance and some pretty good special effects going for him, including the ability to seemingly make people disappear from right off the field. There are a few goofier moments here and there. I don't love this horribly drawn out locker room sequence, but overall, Rambling Ghost works as a quality Geist. Now we're getting into some of the monsters that I find to be particularly terrifying. The Mantis is a grade A ghost. Scooby-Doo has aped a lot of horror movies and franchises up until now, so it's a wonder that it took this long to get an insect monster in the style of Them, the Deadly Mantis, Empire of the Ants, or the Black Scorpion. The Mantis is on the more basic side, but it serves its purpose well, and should leave anyone with entomophobia shaking in their boots. Vulture's Claw is also an amazingly fitting setting, being an abandoned botanical garden, and the episode lays the necessary groundwork by establishing the mad scientist who had been working there previously. Honestly, this monster does just about everything right. I'm very confident having him this high on the list, and we still have 17 monsters left. Season 1's A Frightened Hound Meets Demons Underground introduces us to Scooby's first attempt at a demon monster, and it's one that really does get to me a bit. Now, I am a Christian, but I didn't really grow up being told that demons were coming for me or anything like that, so I do still laud this design. It's monstrous, dangerous, the sound design is good, but let's be honest, the real star of this episode is the Seattle Underground. Just imagine the skeleton of a city underneath your very feet, with a gang of savage demons that could be just a few yards under you at any given moment. The main way that I think this episode could have been improved is if they had taken more inspiration from the actual Seattle Underground, which is really chilling to look at. Speaking of fantastic settings, let's talk about the Spectre of Ebenezer Crab, the Scooby-Doo show's inaugural boogeyman. This episode sees Freddy and Shaggy taking night shift jobs on a construction crew for a building that's being haunted by a dangerous daredevil monster. These scenes of Ebenezer chasing the gang along the skeleton of the building, one step from a deadly fall, are chilling. Like, this makes my heart rate spike a bit. Design-wise, we get a classic Scooby formula, discolored skin and an eccentric dress sense, but it works here alongside the manic grin and the liminality of the setting, a building in the process of being built, a mix of familiarity and foreignness. I don't really see the point of the Nettie Crab disguise. I don't think that adds anything in particular to the episode, but the stellar setting, serviceable design, and a few key spooky jump scares like this one where Ebenezer just appears in the windshield of the Mystery Machine solidify his place in the upper ranks of the Scooby Hall of Fame. And the last monster in this section is the Demon Shark. Now, I know that I ranked the caveman incredibly low when I covered Where Are You? And on the surface, the demon shark is very similar, a prehistoric specimen preserved in ice for untold eons, brought back to life to make Scooby and Shaggy's lives a living torment. But there are some key differences that make the demon shark leagues more terrifying to me. The first one is simple but effective: the fog effects used throughout the episode. Honestly, they're a bit overused throughout all of the Scooby-Doo show, but imagine being in a fog so thick that you have trouble seeing what's around you, only to find this gruesome ghoul chasing you down. But of course, we also have the key difference: a caveman versus a shark creature. Peter Benchley understood that sharks are just downright horrifying, and entire generations have had their days at the beach ruined by a genre of scary movies taking advantage of this. Granted, the demon shark does look a little bit silly, but honestly, that only makes him scarier to me. Sea monsters come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and the depths of the ocean are home to some of the most horrific creatures on Earth. Some of them do look goofy, but in a way that makes them alien, unknowable, horrifying. To me, the demon shark just draws from this deep-sea, unknowable quality. It might not work for you, and if not, I totally understand that. But I feel that the demon shark is well deserving of this spot. And that is it. For now, at least. We have 15 monsters left to get through. I'd love to be able to do all of them in one go, but it's honestly just too much for one video for me. But don't worry, the next video covering the last 15 monsters should be up soon. So in the meantime, let me know down in the comments who you think should be number 1. Or if you think that one of the monsters I've already discussed should be higher on the list. But until then, this is Singularity, and remember to stay curious.